Hey, so this is where I left off the other day at the end of the seventh episode that I watched. We had the ability to move the player around with the mouse. We had three enemies that were bouncing around. Otherwise, still a pretty basic game. At least it is a game now. It's ridiculously easy because there's only three enemies and there's really not much of a goal besides, you know, stay away from them. There's no way to know if you score or anything like that. You're just simply surviving for as long as possible, and you don't really know how long that is either. So if we take a look at day 8, I think I saved it different. It might not have been. Okay, now what we have happening in day 8 is you'll notice that now there's not just three enemies. Every couple seconds, another one pops up, and this actually makes the game rather difficult after a lot of time goes by, because there's no way currently to get rid of enemies, and it gets pretty crowded pretty quick. So if we take a look at day 9 here, which actually goes into day 10, oh, that's another thing that happens. If you notice, once I actually get down to 0 HP, the game actually resets. So if you didn't reset the game, if you didn't make your enemies go away, you would just lose, but you would have just as many red enemies flopping around as you would have had before. So day 9, I feel like for some reason I might not have saved day 8 completely at the end because a lot of different changes happened in day 9 here. So now I've got a bunch of different things. You see me going after these orange and yellow small boxes. Those are called, at least the guy that did the videos called them upgrades. So what you notice is if I get an upgrade, you should see the score up at the top. It goes up by 10,000 for a yellow. If I get an orange, it goes up by 1,000. The other difference is now I have these little gray boxes coming off of me, which you probably call bullets. These, if they hit an enemy, make them disappear and die or whatever you want to call it. So now I've got a little bit more complex of a game. Not only do I have HP, but I have a way to see my score up here. I have enemies that pop up, and I have these bullets that randomly generate and stick around for a little while before they disappear. So let's take a look at some of the code behind this, some of the big differences. Oh, that's another difference too that I didn't mention. Now my green player cannot leave the screen even if my mouse does. So we're getting pretty close to a functional game here, but still if you die, it doesn't like say, hey, you died, here's your score, this is how well you did, do you want to play again, kind of thing. It just automatically starts over and clears everything out. So there's still some things that we can change here, but what I wanted to kind of show and go through is kind of the main thing in the game that is the game is this set interval, and it calls the update function. So if we kind of compare the update function in my day 9 code to what it looked like in day 7. Here's my update function on day 7. Here's my update function on day 9. It got a whole lot bigger. And that's because we had a lot more functionality, or a lot different functions come into the game. So if we start at the beginning here, what this does every time, the clear rectangle, it's been in my code for a while, is it makes it so everything that was there before clears out, so you don't end up with a ton of boxes. Like you would see this, a red box going the whole way with that. So you don't want to see that. We've got, okay, this is the code right here that came in that randomly generates enemies or upgrades, and then I also have one for randomly generating bullets. So this percent sign here is actually the mod function, which tells you a remainder. So when you divide, you end up with remainders. The mod function gets you a remainder. So what you're doing is you're dividing by 100, and if there's a remainder, it tells you what's left over. So if it's 150, if you divide by 100, your remainder is 50, and that's what this function, this mathematical operation would tell you is 50. So what this does is every 4 seconds. So 100, since the frame rate is 25, which how you know it's 25 is actually like 40 milliseconds is 25th of a second. So if you have 100 milliseconds, you're going to have every 4 seconds. I don't really feel like I explained that well, but anyway, 25 frames equals 1 second. So if you have 3 seconds, it's 75. If it's 25, it's 1 second. Okay. So how this random generation function works, which I used several times here, and I'll just kind of show you the enemy here. But how I created enemies in day 7 is I literally had to hard code them, meaning I had to have a line of code for every enemy I wanted to create. And this is why I only had 3 enemies on that game 7 day. Now, every time this update function is called, which is every 40 milliseconds from this set interval function, it tests whether or not 4 seconds has gone by or 3 seconds, and then it calls whatever function is under that. So if we go find that random generation, enemy at least, how the random generation works is you use this math.random function a lot. So math.random randomly returns a number between 0 and 1. So if you have a width that you set, just set it up here, 500, it's going to give you a random x between 0 and 500 by multiplying it by 0 to a number to 1. Or it's going to give you a randomly generated height. You're going to take the height. If you didn't put a minimum here, a 10, and you just did math.random times 30, you would have enemies that were invisible essentially, because if this randomly generated a 0, then you multiply that by 30, that's going to be 0. So then your height would be 0, and you would have an enemy that was invisible. It was still there, but you wouldn't have ever been able to see it. So that's why I've got a lot of these kind of minimum numbers here. So at minimum, it's going to be 5. At most, it can be plus 1 times 5. So the speed can be 5 to 10. Or the height here can be 10 to 40. Because the most you could have here is 1 times 30. Right. Then we randomly generate an ID so we can refer to that enemy. Doesn't matter what the ID is, and then we create the enemy. So this is how we can determine or code a game to come up with new enemies without the programmer actually needing to create individual lines in the code to make those enemies. And this random generation thing happens in tons of games. So if you've got enemies that pop up in any game, or blocks that come down from the top, or things that shoot out at you, anything that just happens seemingly on its own, it's more than likely got a lot of random math.random kind of things in it. And they happen at certain time intervals, or when a certain thing happens, when you pass a certain point, or whatever. Right. So that was the big thing that happened here. We have a ton of different things that are randomly generating, whether it's an upgrade or an enemy or things like that. Right. Then we go through a bunch of different entities. It's kind of the general term for them, but I'm going to test for each bullet in the bullet list. I'm going to start a timer. I'm going to add to that timer. If the timer gets above 100, then that bullet goes away. So I delete the bullet from that list. Okay. Then the other thing I have to do is I have to test to see if that bullet is colliding with an enemy. So that's why making these functions so general is very, very useful, because now I can test bullets in enemies. I can test the player in the enemy down here. I can test, I think there's a player, yep, a player and an upgrade. So I can see if I collided with an upgrade. So that same function works for all sorts of different types of objects that we have in our game. You just have to tell it which objects you want to test. So it becomes super functional, super useful for us, because we don't have to rewrite the code for test collision. We don't have to have a test collision for player and enemy. We don't have to have a test collision for bullets and enemies. All we have to do is put in the different objects we want to test. Okay, so some of the things that happen here: if the bullet collides with the enemy, I delete the enemy from the list, and I also delete the bullet from the list, so they disappear. If I have a collision between the player and the enemy, I still take away a hit point, an HP. Right. If I have a collision between a player and an upgrade, it's going to test. It says if the upgrade category is low or equals low, meaning it's the orange one, you're going to add 1,000 to your score. If the upgrade category is high, then you're going to add 10,000 to your score. And then you're going to get rid of that upgrade, so it's not there anymore. So I deleted the upgrade. Okay. So then if the player has less than or equal to 0, meaning you've lost the game, you're going to call this new function here called start game. Start new game, which is up here. Right. So this is just kind of setting things back to what they were at the beginning. So you're going to start your HP at 10 again, which was what you started with. You're going to make the enemy list blank. That's what these empty brackets mean. It means you're making this list empty again. Your upgrades are going to disappear because you made your upgrade list empty. You made your bullet list empty, so it got rid of all the bullets. This frame count is kind of the game time. It's how many times you've called this upgrade or update function, so you can get a score that way. Your score is going to go to 0. You're going to reset your start time so you don't know, so your time can start over. And then you're going to make 3 enemies randomly. So I called the random generate enemy function 3 times. So I always start with 3 enemies. Okay. So that's the big highlights there. The code kind of got a little bit more complicated. I didn't explain all of it super well or in detail, but that's the general gist of the updates that have come from 2 days of game or of videos, day 8 and 9. It's getting close to a functioning game. Should be good to see what it looks like in the next couple days. Otherwise, have a good weekend.